Go home and go home in peace.
Buongiorno, se volete accomodarvi possiamo cominciare questa terza giornata dei Milano Transition Days. Sono Massimiliano Tarantino e do il benvenuto a tutti voi che siete qui in sala e tutti coloro che ci vedono in streaming. Questo appunto è il terzo dei 3 appuntamenti, delle 3 giornate in programma dei nostri Milano Transition Days. 3 giornate di lavoro che abbiamo progettato per delineare con il vostro contributo scenari evolutivi che permettano di rendere praticabile e attuabile la transizione, suggerendo priorità e fornendo stimoli ai decisori politici in modo tale da aiutarli a valutare gli impatti della transizione sulle economie, sulle nostre città e sui cittadini. Lo scorso 23 settembre da Washington a Nairobi, da Venezia a Milano, i giovani di tutto il mondo sono tornati in piazza a protestare per il clima e a chiedere ai leader mondiali di agire in fretta per difendere il nostro pianeta. Lo avevano fatto anche prima della pandemia in tutti gli angoli del globo. Sono tornati in piazza finalmente. Nello stesso giorno, in apertura dell'Assemblea di Confindustria, il Presidente del Consiglio Mario Draghi ha dichiarato che la transizione ecologica non è una scelta, bensì una necessità, sottolineando che i cambiamenti climatici hanno già gravi conseguenze sulle nostre vite, il nostro pianeta e le nostre economie. Citando le sue parole, ricordo che dice: se non interveniamo subito, i loro effetti rischiano di peggiorare e di diventare irreversibili, e l'ha ripetuto proprio in questi giorni qui a Milano. Centrali in questa prospettiva sono i programmi che costituiscono la dotazione finanziaria dei Next Generation Europe, ma da soli non sono sufficienti. Occorre fare sì che la concretizzazione delle strategie di implementazione del Piano Nazionale di Ripresa e Resilienza sia frutto di azioni integrate tra pratiche, metodi, modelli innovativi che nascono dal coinvolgimento dei territori e delle comunità di ricerca e delle comunità di pratica. Questo modello partecipato è una espressione, forse la massima espressione del metodo di ricerca di questa fondazione. Noi vogliamo sostenere una componente fondamentale della nostra democrazia, la domanda di buona politica, cioè la sollecitazione rivolta a tutte le parti sociali a conoscere, a confrontarsi, per reclamare buona gestione a chi si interessa a chi si occupa dell'interesse pubblico. Non basta riconoscere l'urgenza delle sfide che abbiamo dinanzi. Serve che il percorso verso la transizione passi dal confronto e dal dialogo tra i diversi attori e settori della società. Questo per noi è l'autentico ruolo della cultura. Occorre l'impegno di tutti, a tutti i livelli, per domandare alla politica la necessità di intestarsi la responsabilità di attuare investimenti e scelte più giuste e inclusive, a partire dal confronto con le realtà e con le pratiche. Transizione è un termine che spesso lascia pensare a un fenomeno graduale e naturale, come se questo viaggio trasformativo fosse già tracciato, come se ne conoscessero le tappe e la destinazione. La transizione ecologica è un processo di cambiamento che non riguarda solo politiche di tutela ambientale e sviluppo tecnologico, ma riguarda gli stili di vita, le modalità con cui progettiamo e organizziamo le nostre città, le trasformazioni della mobilità, la transizione energetica, le relazioni di comunità e coinvolge in prima persona i comportamenti e le abitudini di tutti noi. Per questo motivo abbiamo bisogno di scelte drastiche e cambiamenti duraturi, di un'evoluzione del ruolo degli attori pubblici, economici, sociali. Abbiamo bisogno di innovazione supportata dalla tecnologia, di un aggiornamento delle competenze e dello sviluppo di processi partecipativi in cui gli attori economici e sociali, e soprattutto i cittadini, possano giocare un ruolo attivo nella dimensione decisionale. Si chiama democrazia partecipativa ed è tempo, secondo noi, di metterla in pratica. Siamo molto contenti del riscontro che abbiamo ricevuto di queste 3 giornate di lavoro della prima edizione dei Milano Transition Days, grazie alle interlocuzioni avviate con tutti voi. 9 centri di ricerca e università, 9 realtà di investimento, 11 innovation hub, 20 imprese, oltre 40 start-up, scale-up e spin-off universitari e oltre 20 rappresentanti di istituzioni ed esperti internazionali. Oggi, nella giornata conclusiva di questa iniziativa, intendiamo occuparci di gestione sostenibile delle risorse idriche e agroalimentari, dopo aver parlato di mobilità il primo giorno e transizione energetica ieri. La crisi legata alla pandemia ci ha mostrato ancora di più la necessità di un nuovo approccio alla produzione, distribuzione e accessibilità delle risorse alimentari, che si inseriscono nella più ampia riflessione sull'importanza di ridefinire il rapporto con il pianeta e le sue risorse. Se da un lato la produzione intensiva e la grande distribuzione si sono dovute misurare con le limitazioni connesse alla pandemia, dall'altro hanno trovato spazio diverse iniziative caratterizzate dalla trasparenza delle filiere, dal minor impatto ambientale e da un rapporto più diretto tra produttori, fornitori di servizi e consumatori. Ci chiediamo in che modo la filiera produttiva agroalimentare può essere ripensata per la promozione di nuove economie capaci di ridurre gli sprechi, ridurre gli impatti sull'ambiente e allo stesso tempo garantire l'accesso a un'alimentazione sana? Quali ruoli e responsabilità per i principali attori coinvolti nella filiera agroalimentare, pubblici e privati? Siamo nel vivo della conferenza preparatoria a COP26. Milano è in questo momento al centro del mondo per il dibattito sui temi della transizione e del cambiamento climatico. Questi giorni in fondazione, che rientrano nel palinsesto All for Climate promosso dal Ministero della Transizione Ecologica e nel programma Food Wave promosso da Commissione Europea e Comune di Milano, vogliono essere il contributo di tutti noi, concreto e pragmatico, al processo di transizione giusta della nostra società. Ringrazio in primo luogo tutti voi per il tempo che ci avete dedicato, il Ministero delle Politiche Agricole e Assolombarda per il patrocinio, lo staff della Fondazione Gian Giacomo Feltrinelli e Azzurra Spirito, collaboratrice di questa fondazione sui Milano Transition Days, che hanno reso possibile questa iniziativa. Ringrazio in particolare i facilitatori e le facilitatrici che accompagneranno i tavoli di oggi, Guglielmo Apolloni, designer e imprenditore sociale, Gabriella Piccolo, Senior Design Service, e Claudio Marciano, ricercatore in sociologia e politiche dell'innovazione presso l'Università di Torino. Vi siete fatti vedere? Sì. 1, 2 e la terza? Ah, il terzo. Non c'è il terzo? Ok. Ci sono? No, io controllo. Ringrazio naturalmente tutti i relatori che prenderanno parte a questa sessione, sia alla giornata che alla sessione plenaria conclusiva, e ringrazio veramente calorosamente il moderatore Ferdinando Cotugno, al quale passo la parola e auguro buon lavoro. Buon lavoro a tutti, grazie.
Buongiorno a tutte e tutti. Io sono Ferdinando Cotugno, faccio il giornalista, ma in questa sede guiderò la parte pubblica di questo processo molto importante al quale prenderete parte oggi. Sono stati 3 giorni molto intensi, per me di grande ispirazione, e ci siamo occupati di mobilità, quindi di come le persone si muovono, di energia, quindi di come le persone accendono la propria vita, ma oggi andiamo nel punto più vicino all'essere vivi delle persone, quindi lo sapete benissimo, vi occupate dello spazio nel quale si verificano più ingiustizie a livello globale, cibo e acqua, quindi la delicatezza del vostro lavoro non la devo sottolineare io, però voglio ricordarla perché è importante, perché è veramente parte di questo contesto, e il contesto più ampio lo ricordava Massimiliano, e Milano in un fermento incredibile, perché c'è la Pre-COP, c'è Youth for Climate, i giovani sono in piazza, in strada in questo momento per protestare, per chiedere, e c'è questo fermento che è fatto di conflitto, c'è grande conflitto in questi giorni a Milano, ma c'è anche grande bisogno. C'è bisogno di quello che farete voi oggi anche, c'è bisogno di progettazione, c'è bisogno della capacità di visualizzare gli snodi, i problemi, la capacità di restituire alla politica idee, proposte, insight, soluzioni, perché la politica è anche un po' smarrita in questo momento, ha bisogno del lavoro di persone come voi e del lavoro che si fa in sedi come queste. Farete un percorso che secondo me costruite in modo molto interessante, perché segue tutto il viaggio del cibo, dall'agricoltura, dall'acqua che viene usata nell'agricoltura al consumo, a un consumo che deve essere sano e soprattutto accessibile, giusto. Qui si parla tanto di una transizione che non deve essere solo ecologica, deve essere giusta. È una transizione giusta, una transizione inclusiva, e non può che passare dal cibo. E poi la gestione degli scarti. Gli scarti che sono forse la sede principale dell'ingiustizia, della nostra possibilità di visualizzare l'ingiustizia che c'è nel cibo. Quindi io vi auguro davvero buon lavoro. E prima di cominciare, permettervi di sedervi ai tavoli, ci sarà un intervento di Chantal Clement che si collega da Londra. Sarà un momento per fornirvi un altro po' di contesto, di ispirazione, di idee. Il suo intervento durerà 15 minuti, poi ci saranno 15 minuti per delle domande, quindi vi chiedo di pensare a delle domande, delle curiosità, degli stimoli per la conversazione. Chantal Clement è la vice direttrice del International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food System, quindi cibo sostenibile, che è esattamente quello che stiamo cercando di fare oggi. Quindi lascio la parola a Chantal Clement, poi ci ritroviamo qui per le domande e proseguire la conversazione. Grazie.
Good morning, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much to the Fondazione for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor, I think, to be speaking alongside the great series of keynote speakers that there have been over the past few days to start your discussions each day. And I have to say, I think it's very fitting that food should be the last topic that you've been discussing over these 3 days, because there's really nothing like food to bring people together. And it's not only people that food brings together, but all the different issues that are most relevant to our society right now. I think food relates us to climate and nature, to our economy, to public health, to fairness and justice for our workers, and even democracy, as was mentioned. And this week especially, you would have likely been hearing the very strong words that have been delivered by our youth climate leaders at the Youth for Climate conference and the pre-COP, which is happening in your city. You know, they've been saying that they're tired of hearing the same promises from our leaders, that there's too little action on climate change. But I think really the same thing could be said about a lack of political action to make our food systems more sustainable. And I know I'm speaking to a very informed, a very engaged audience, so I'll be very brief in starting my discussion with the problems that our food systems are facing today. So we all know that food systems are degrading our environment, they're increasing greenhouse gas emissions, they're leading to the deforestation and the degradation of natural resources, food waste, public health and nutrition challenges, difficult lives for food and farm workers, and of course all of this while some of the most vulnerable people still don't have access to healthy and nutritious food. And as was mentioned, not just facing a climate crisis right now, we're also facing a health crisis, a social crisis, a biodiversity crisis, and that all of these things are very interlinked. But right now, I think food systems are a major part of that problem, but they can also be a huge part of the solution. Because what's important for us to remember is it's not all food systems that are causing these problems, but it's really the dominant model that's driving the logic of how we produce, process, and consume our food. Because the focus right now is on profit maximization. It's on productivity maximization. So we continue to depend and to perpetuate a system that really relies on the exploitation of people and of the planet just to be able to eat. And specifically, I think we all also know that it's the industrial logic of today's dominant food systems that is driving these many problems. And we also know, of course, that this is a totally illogical system that makes itself and us vulnerable to the very problems that these systems are causing. So if we really want to tackle the many crises I just mentioned, if we really want to get to sustainable food systems, we have to radically reshape them. And it's really only moving in the direction of a real paradigm shift, a real transition that we just talked about, that will really get us to where we need to be. So to do that, I really want to leave you with these three main interconnected messages. The first one is, if we want to make our systems resilient, equitable, and just, we can only do this if we look at systems, if we take a systems approach to our problems. And this really means looking at the many different parts of our food system together at the same time and understanding how they influence one another and how they're interconnected. This is especially important for policymaking around food. I think in most countries, in most cities, we know that the responsibility for food issues are divided across many different departments, like the Department of Agriculture, of Trade, of Health, of Labor, of Energy, of Environment. And all of these different departments have completely different priorities, and often they have conflicting goals. For example, maybe we want to promote healthy diets, but we also right now are giving the most agricultural subsidies to big commodities that are used either for intensive livestock production or to make unhealthy processed foods. So again, there's these big incoherencies across how food policies are made and across these different sectors. But it's not just across sectors. I think there's also these important inconsistencies between different levels of government that we need to integrate better. So for example, if you're working at the city level and if public schools want to supply healthier meals and accessible meals to their children, but the EU or the national government is setting up policies in place that make it very difficult to do that because of market competition rules or because of a lack of budget, these higher policy levels can be very limiting to what's happening at the local level. So again, understanding the whole system and its dynamics allow for different sectors and different levels to coordinate better with one another to try to fix all of these different contradictions. I think the second major issue is that really we need real food democracy. And I think I heard these words being said, citizenship, democracy, a lot during the introduction. And a big part of the problem, as you probably know as well, is that our food systems today are an issue because of who has power to make the decisions and, of course, who does not. And we know that it's this very strong concentration of power in the global food systems that is leading us to where we are. Very few companies control most of the markets for seeds, for production inputs. Very few companies control the processing sector, the retail sector. And this shapes the foods that we're able to access. It shapes the choices we're able to make. And of course, the policies that keep these systems in place. So instead, food democracy means having active citizens who are able to have more democratic control over their system. It means having more participation from a much wider variety of stakeholders than right now in decision-making about food. So having food democracy ideally would allow us to develop the right policies that respond to what people want and what they need, and not leave these very important decisions to market forces as we have right now. Which of course leads me to my third largest point, which is if we recognize that we need to look at the whole system, and if we need food democracy, how do we get there? I think you know this because you're already sitting at these tables today, but cities, regions, and local governments are already leading some of the most sustainable food systems transitions and reform. And for me, it's really at the local level that some of the most exciting work and some of the greatest food systems innovations are happening. I think, of course, the city of Milan has been particularly a global leader in this respect, in encouraging food action through the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact and the work that it's been doing in its own city and internationally. And the local level specifically, I think, is creating the alternative to the dominant food system model. And one of the major reasons because local level governments tend to be able to listen better to their citizens. I think it's why we're seeing so many ambitious local food strategies around the world, because local decisions for food policies tend to be a bit more participatory, more responsive to what people need on the ground. And it's really at this level that everyone can do their part. And all around the world, at the local level, we're seeing so many examples of positive initiatives. We're seeing food waste reduction schemes and the move towards local circularity economies. As I mentioned, we have healthy and sustainable food procurement for schools, for universities, and for public canteens. We're seeing the development of public campaigns to encourage changes in healthy diets. We're seeing the creation of urban gardens, public orchards, incubator farms for new farmers, the creation of regional food hubs where processing is done locally and it can be shared locally. We're just seeing more support for these short supply chain initiatives, like community-supported agriculture, more farmers markets, and even these solidarity economy initiatives, like food cooperatives, that really help to improve access to food in affordable and healthy ways. Some cities are also strengthening their ties with the countryside to ensure better and more diverse supply of local food. So really looking not just beyond, looking beyond the city to be thinking more creatively around how to arrange space. Another interesting one is I'm seeing the creation of a lot of urban land committees to make sure that the community can access unused land and resources in the city itself. And of course, some regions and cities are thinking very ambitiously by creating pesticide-free zones, GMO-free districts, or even these bio and organic regions. And I think what's important about many of these initiatives, and while they might seem very familiar to you, is that these are happening at the local level first and most often. And I think most of these initiatives can come about because, as I said, of the strong mechanisms for people to participate in their food systems, especially through local food policy councils and active citizen communities. And this is how the food democracy issue that I mentioned becomes very important and is able to thrive and happen. Probably for a practical example, the Toronto Food Policy Council in Canada is often used as one of the oldest and most ideal examples of what food democracy could look like. And I think it's actually celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, but many of them have developed since. And as you know, the Food Policy Council is really just this idea that active citizens can improve the world at the local level. And this idea grew because concerned community groups, concerned civil servants really thought that there was just too much power in the hands of corporate lobbies, of certain decision makers, and there wasn't enough happening on the ground. So food policy councils have a tendency, if they're structured correctly, to bring people from diverse backgrounds together with different jobs, different perspectives, cultures, different ages, gender, social class, all coming together to discuss and reflect on the changes they all agree on to see what their food systems can do. I think more and more we're seeing city governments who are willing and able to work directly with these citizen-based food policy councils to get ideas of what initiatives they should be taking on and how to work more collaboratively together. And I think now there's over 100 food policy councils all over the world following this model. And for me, it's really such a strong example of what can be done for everyone to equally participate in food systems. Because it's really these types of participatory structures that are creating new spaces for democratic debate on environmental sustainability, on social justice, on economic resilience, and really on how all of these things relate to food in very transformative ways. And I think what we also find the most successful in local level initiatives is that a community is never just working on a single issue. Again, I think when there's real engagement around food from the community, this is how we develop these comprehensive food strategies that tackle multiple issues of the system at the same time. So, for example, we're talking about developing urban gardens to improve food access, while changing the zoning laws to make land more available to citizens, while hosting educational events on food and nutrition, while seeing how those things connect to improve access to vulnerable communities to healthy foods. And of course, all of these things are also improving the urban environment from an environmental perspective at the same time. So really, it's thinking through these connections and how one initiative connects to another, but how it also has many benefits that are not just dealing with one single part of the food systems. So really, I think creating these spaces and these kinds of multi-targeted initiatives is really what allows us to tackle the structural problems of the food systems, because it's only by looking at the foundation of our systems, the structure, that we can really drive the necessary solutions for this bold paradigm shift that we need. And the initiatives, again, also really show that when citizens are engaged, when governments really respond to their needs, when they really listen, and when local businesses are also engaged in these dynamics, when there's new opportunities for them, that these three different groups can really work to create real change and achieve a lot. I think it really shows that it's up to not just one group of actors. It's not up to just citizens. It's not just up to the government or just to corporations to figure out how to do their part. It's really this collaborative work that allows us to shift the current system. And of course, I won't say that to be able to get there absolutely must be political willingness and the leadership to create this enabling environment for these initiatives to happen. But it's really only once all of these parties work together that this can really thrive. I think when the current food system is perceived as a public problem rather than a personal problem or an individual responsibility, that's where we can really learn from a greater diversity of experiences and perspectives to develop solutions. I think perhaps one of the issues right now is we're focusing too much on the individual. We're putting too much responsibility on the consumer, on me, you, on the person. But it's really by taking collective ownership that we can get to where we need to be. So I think maybe I'll just end with the idea that while local action has incredible potential, there's also a lot of possibility at this level. I don't think we can say that localizing food systems completely will be enough to bring about the food systems transformation that we need to make sure that everyone around the world has access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient healthy foods. I think we know especially that this is true when multinational corporations continue to operate at the global scale, that trade rules continue to govern a lot of how food is produced and how it's distributed. So I think while food system change definitely needs to start at home, this is the first big step. There's also a lot of advocacy work that you shouldn't forget that needs to happen and be done at the national level, at the EU level, and at the international level to really unlock this full transition potential. And of course, as I said, we have to connect all of these levels and all of these actions to ensure that they're each supporting each other towards sustainability. I think already it was because of pressure from civil society that we saw the European Commission develop this farm-to-fork strategy last year. This is really the first big attempt to create a comprehensive strategy for environment, food, and health at a higher level of government. And IPES Food, my organization, really worked with civil society, with researchers, with EU-level policymakers, also local mayors, and just every different level and every different sector of the food system to make sure that we were putting pressure, as I said, on the Commission to make sure that they were realizing that food can't just be taken care of by the agricultural department. It can't just be looked at separately by trade or, as I said, by health and other departments, that you really need to develop this comprehensive strategy to be able to do the work we need. And hopefully this farm-to-fork strategy is one first positive step in this direction at the EU level. And of course, we need these initiatives at the national level, at the local level as well. Even at the international level, I think it's really because of joint pressure from local and national food movements around the world that we were able to create space within the United Nations system to discuss food, specifically in this case through the Committee on World Food Security. So we're seeing through food policy councils at the local level, through these changes happening at the national, the EU level, and even at the international level, that we can create these participatory democratic spaces for citizens to be able to voice their concerns and for them to be picked up by policymakers. I think it's because of this same mobilization that we're even just seeing more discussion on food issues, on climate, at major international conferences like COP26, like the work that you're doing this week. So I think there's been so much talk in the last few years because of the COVID pandemic that, we have to build back better. But I think we actually just need to build something fundamentally different. We're not building back. We need to build forward, and we need to build fundamentally differently. I think this is only how we get to something more sustainable, more just, more resilient, really that puts people and nature back at the heart of our solutions. And I think, again, as I said, and I'll say again, it's really, these demands can only be met because of collaborative and participatory work between civil society, between progressive businesses, and supportive policymakers working together at all levels and across the entire food systems to get to where we need. So I know you'll be discussing practical solutions later today on what you can do for an ecological transitions in your city later today. So I think there's two things. I really encourage you, of course, to think boldly, to think ambitiously of the many connected ways that food systems can be improved. But I think at the same time, I encourage you to be practical and to think about what can be achieved quickly right now. What are the kind of burning issues in your city that you can start building on to really start laying out this path towards food system sustainability? Because we know that a good strategy is built on immediate short-term actions that are part of medium and long-term initiatives, and that all of this is really to support bigger level policy and structural change. And of course, the thing is, it can be a bit discouraging, but all of this takes time, but it's absolutely possible. And we're already seeing many of these types of changes occurring all around the world, and as I said, especially at the local level. And I think the Fondazione opened the discussion today by saying that the word transition is, transition means something progressive, it means something natural. And this is absolutely how we get there, by building the steps little by little for something, very, very big to change. So I think I'll stop there, but thanks a lot for your attention, and I look forward to any questions or discussions that we can have now with your comments and your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chantal. I like bold and quick. I like it as a political program. Then I'm going to ask the audience if there's any question. I saw a lot of people taking notes, so I assume there's going to be a lot of questions. Quindi qualcuno ha già una prima domanda da fare? There's a first question. Sta arrivando il microfono.
Hello, hi. Thank you for inspiring talk. I'm Raffaele Giaffreda from Fondazione Bruno Kessler. I'm also a co-founder of a startup that works in the business of food creation. So the problems we face are always related to the willingness of farmers, first to adopt our technologies, and then consumers to appreciate the efforts that those farmers do in order to produce more sustainably. So the question goes back to incentivizing such virtuous behaviors. And my question for you is whether or not there are any examples, leading examples that you're aware of, maybe not at national level, but maybe regional or a community level, where you think that these people got it right and they could be used like in any other context. Usually things that don't happen at, let's say, macro level, they happen because of word of mouth. And agriculture is one of the examples. The farmers don't do anything until their neighbors show that they can produce better with certain technologies, and then all of a sudden word of mouth makes wonder. So having a leading example that you think could be a seed for showing the rest of the world what it takes and what are the advantages and the outcomes of going a certain way, that would be also a good starting point. Do you have any of these examples? Thank you.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that directly before moving to another question. I think there's a lot of cities doing this, and I admit off the top of my head, I know that there were some in France and Canada. I'm sure that there's some in Italy as well. But for me, the idea of food hubs, if you're familiar with this term, is a very good way of sensitizing consumers or citizens in terms of what farmers are doing, but also just creating a whole space for food in the city. I actually know that Liège right now, so Liège is a city in Belgium, is developing this kind of food house or this food hub where producers and consumers can interact, not just through farmers markets and these usual types of exchanges, but it's also a space for discussion. It's also a space for kind of lesson sharing and kind of mutual learning from one another. But with the large enough space, there's also space for incubator initiatives. So where new businesses have some funds, usually from the municipality or from other small grants, to be able to set up, try out their business, see if it works. And of course, under these structures, you're sharing space because, as you know, if you're a new business, it's extremely costly to start a new food business. So then you're sharing equipment with others who are trying to do similar projects, and you're allowing people to come in and see how you're developing. So I think when you have these types of spaces where you can have some elements of food production, of food processing, of distribution, and of consumption in the same area, people can really, I think, visually see what it takes to do food, to produce and to process food. And it's a really good learning opportunity for urban citizens to know what's going on. And of course, where the policy support comes in all of this, it's really, these are often initiatives that are led by the city. So it's the city that will tend to provide or support the creation of this space through building, through zoning, through creation of the infrastructure, and also in supporting some of the funds to go into this. So again, it's really a municipally supported sort of private entrepreneurial project, but where everyone is very involved, not just from the market side, but also from the kind of democratic and participation side. So again, for me, these food hubs, if you can look into it, for me is always a really positive example that has a lot of different benefits.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question from the audience? None? Oh. Suddenly, two questions.
Hey, yes. Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about innovation. So in this process of change, how do you think we can make sure that we bet on the right technology solutions and we invest in the right spot, making sure that we remain quite open-minded to the potentially scientific breakthrough, but at the same time, also making sure that it remains an inclusive and socially fair process? Because I think that today the risk is that maybe there are a lot of enthusiasm for some solutions, and the risk is that maybe we lock our money into certain infrastructure, or like electrification or hydrogen, for example, for the mobility sector. But the same could happen also for the agri-food sector.
That's an excellent question, and I think a very tricky one to answer, because I think, as you said, we need to remain open-minded to all types of innovations. Innovation can be anything from a technology to just a different way of organizing people and business. But I think there's two major issues there. The first one you already pointed to, it's that when we are only putting all of our eggs in one basket, if we're locking ourselves into the same paradigm that is driving, that's currently in play, we're not going to be exploring the breadth of alternatives that already exist. So I think, these new technologies that are coming out are extremely exciting. They're extremely innovative. But I think we just need to make sure that they're developed and that they're supported in a way equal to other options. I think probably in debates right now, you're often hearing that there seems to be this tension between these very modern high-tech technologies and things like agroecology or organic agriculture, and these types of things that base themselves a bit more on nature and kind of processes where you don't need a lot of technology. But these things can absolutely be compatible if they're done in the right way. As I said, if we put enough funding into all types of alternatives, you can really just develop a diversity of solutions, because that's what we need right now. We've seen that when we only pursue one pathway, this leads us to the problems that we have right now, because there's no in English we say there's no silver bullet solution. There's never just one answer. So it's really about making sure, as you said, that we're exploring the breadth of options that we have. Specifically around technologies, and I'm not sure if this is what you were meaning, there's also a question around access to data. This is an issue that comes up a lot, because of a lot of the new technologies coming out are proprietary. They have very closed rules in terms of, so especially for the farmer level, especially for the kind of producer level, it's really about making sure that everyone has open access to data, that you're still information sharing, and that these things are really not being locked into, again, as I said, the same paradigms that we had before. I think when we explore new innovations, new technologies, we need to inscribe them in this new paradigm shift from the beginning, ones that are inclusive, that are open, that are accessible. And this is tricky because it requires some policy changes about intellectual property rules, about kind of data protection, about sharing of information. So again, I think that we need to explore all options, but that we need to do so quite carefully, just to make sure that everything is being supported and funded the way it should be.
There was another question in the first line.
Thank you very much. My question is about timescales. While I fully agree that the long-term strategy is the one that you have set up, I'm afraid that the pace at which we are depleting our resources and also the rate, the population is increasing at a very fast rate, and people are asking for more food and quality food, which can be very costly in terms of natural resources. So democracy is the right word, but typically it is a slow process, and bottom-up processes are slow. Is there a risk for the system to collapse? That the long term we are not able to reach the objective that you have set up with your long-term strategy?
Unfortunately, I think system collapse is always a possibility, and I think some people might argue that it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, because then that's really what allows us and forces us to have to rethink the system. But hopefully it's not going to come to that. I think this is why I was really stressing the idea of short-term gains working in favor of a long-term goal. And I think I mentioned that IPES Food developed with civil society and a whole group of stakeholders this common food policy for the European Union a few years ago. And I draw on this process because I think it contributed to developing the EU farm to fork strategy. But what it did is it really looked at, if you look at the policy the way it is right now, and I have a policy focus, of course, what are the short-term things that we can change right now that would already really unlock the transition? So by how much can we cut chemical inputs in food systems? School food is another one that always comes up because it's actually something very easy to change. It's just about redirecting funding. How can we make, even, this is a bit beyond food, but how can we make cities more, how can we just transport things more easily into the city? How can we get around in the city through bike lanes, these types of things? There's plenty of initiatives that you can change right now that would have massive effects immediately on the food system. And I think it's those types of initiatives that we need to be looking at, these low-hanging fruit, these short-term gains that we can have that are part of, like I said, a bigger strategy. I think the reason for that is we need to be realistic that things take time. So we can't switch everything tomorrow. That wouldn't work. I think maybe you were speaking about energy yesterday, but we can't all switch to renewable energy tomorrow, unfortunately, because we need the batteries, we need the infrastructure to be able to do that. It's the same thing with food. I think we just need to think about what can be done right away and ensure that that's part of a longer term process, understanding that the length of it is inherently part of transition, that things are unfortunately a bit slow, but that there's things you can do immediately to contribute to making it happen a bit faster. And of course, that being said, this only happens, I think, specifically with redirecting of public funding. That's a key thing that I think is really underutilized right now. If we look at city budgets, national budgets, even the EU budget, we see that a lot of funding is going in the wrong direction. And if you were just, as a first step, to start redirecting that progressively, you could really get to something much more sustainable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're done with the questions. So thank you for your contribution. You put really a lot on the table, and I think everyone's going to make good use of what you told us. So I wish you a beautiful day in London. Thank you very much. And I also, anzi, saluto chi ci sta seguendo in streaming. Si chiude questa prima parte della giornata, la prima parte pubblica della giornata. Ora cominciano i lavori veri e propri, e quindi chiamo sul palco Azzurra Spirito, che guiderà il processo e che è la sherpa di questa diplomazia della conoscenza che si fa qui alla Fondazione Feltrinelli. Buon lavoro a tutti.